Hey everybody, welcome to Module 6. I'm sporting some new specs for this week and hopefully forever. I've always been a glasses wearer. I just haven't had them for 2 years because my pair broke 2 years ago and I never got them again. So this week we're going to be talking about field studies and quasi-experiments. And these studies, this lecture is supposed to lead up to your creation of your field study materials for your final project in the coming week. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And in today's lecture, we're going to have one on the ins and outs of field studies, and then we're going to have a second lecture, which will be our final lecture on quasi-experiments. So we'll talk about everything from their designs and what they are to the problems or problems, as I've spelled here, problems with quasi-experiments. This glare is distracting me. I don't see the glare, but you do. I'm just going to cover my eyes. Oh, that's not going to work because I can't see the screen then. It's just going to have to be okay. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about some field studies here. So first off, what is a field study? Well, by definition, these are studies that use either correlational or experimental designs. I refer to them as field experiments, but technically they're field studies because they can have correlational designs too. And they're correlational designs or experimental designs that occur in a natural setting. So let's just start out by looking at an example of a really nice field study. So in this study done by Bibb Latané and John Darley in 1970, they had University of Columbia students where they worked approach strangers in Greenwich Village, and they wanted to see if the type of request that they had for a person would influence their compliance. Okay, so maybe there's a difference between asking, say, for some change, like, hey, could you break $1? Remember, it's 1970, so breaking $1 into quarters was probably a thing back then. I don't know if you even know what a quarter is in this class. Versus, hey, could you give me a kidney? I had not planned what I was going to say, but I tried to think of the most crazy thing that someone could ask for who's a stranger, and that was it. So does the type of request influence compliance? So they walked up to people in the streets of Greenwich Village and would ask them questions. Okay. And in this study, to maintain a good procedural control, the students were asked to be as unselective as possible. Okay, now it's 1970 in the village, and maybe they might be approaching some folks who might be a little seedier than others. But they admitted in the paper that there might have been a tendency for our students who were asking these folks requests to avoid the most seedy or most threatening prospective compliers. So maybe if you're in the village in this time in 1970 and you're a research assistant in this study, and you see somebody who's all decked out and in clothes that might look threatening to you, maybe you might avoid them and you go ask the mom with children for your request. Okay, and here are the 5 requests. So some of them were really simple, like what time is it? And then you can see it increases in the time it takes to respond. So like, could you tell me how to get to Times Square? I've been to New York a couple times in the city, and people are actually really friendly there. They'll tell you how to get to places, and I had to get some help to find the megabus one time. So I was getting a bus ride back down to Richmond, Virginia. So you can see this is the number of people that were asked in each condition, and this is the percent of people that help. The letters A and B are kind of like a Tukey test or any kind of post hoc test. What it's saying is that all of these percentages belong together. They all belong to group A, and these all belong to group B. So let's look at some more of these. Can you give me change for a quarter? Okay, that might take some more time. I got to get out my purse, so I got to reach into my pocket and pull out all this change and count it up and make sure that that I can get you the right amount of change. And a quarter is really hard to break. Do you want two 10-cent pieces and five, or do you want three 5-cent pieces and a 10? How's this going to work for you? Then, as you can see, the increase stopped focusing on time, and it started focusing more on more sensitive information. So, for example, here, what is your name? Okay, that's kind of weird. Has any stranger ever walked up to you and said, what is your name? But not me. So you can see that the compliance is going down quite a bit here. And then, can you give me a dime? No, they're not referring to that kind of dime, like an actual dime that you can use as currency. Although I guess there would be a low compliance rate with the first thing that I said too. You got to pay no matter what. So strangers are probably going to be less likely to give you a dime. So that's materially costly to you. Okay, so this is a really neat study where they're looking at how increasing the amount of cost to folks can reduce compliance or reduce helping behavior. Okay, so what are some positive and negative aspects of this study? Well, let's focus on the positive. Well, there's really high generalizability. We know this is how people will behave in the real world because we're studying them in the real world. They don't know that they're in a study. And here the conditions have been set up so that they can be increasing in material and time cost to participants. Okay, so this is a really well-designed study, but there's also a bad aspect to that. So let's talk about some of the negatives. Is the name question realistic? I guess it depends on what they were going for. If they're trying to increase the material or time cost, maybe so, but I don't know. I don't know if that's a good condition for this this independent variable. Also, I have some questions about the independent variable. Are all 5 of these conditions measuring the same kind or changing the same kind of cost to the participants in the study? I don't think that they are. So if you wanted to say something a little bit more about the internal validity of the study, it's not even clear what the independent variable is. Is it material cost? Is it time cost? Is it just like a weird question like, what is your name? I don't even know what category that would fit into. Okay, and then is there selection bias? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about selection bias here in a few moments. But selection bias basically refers to when you have folks who you're intentionally not selecting in the study, and then it reduces the generalizability. So maybe they do want to study those seedy characters that they were supposed to approach, but most likely didn't. So let's talk about constructing field experiments. And most of the construction of field experiments focuses on the location and the independent variable. So let's start out with location. So location is important, so important that I wrote it 3 times here. So here in field studies, we actually choose to do a field study because we want to select a site that brings a particular sample or belonging to a group into the light. So we might want to select people based on their age or their occupation. Maybe we want to make a statement about what it's like to use this manipulation in the workforce. Maybe it's one to increase productivity, and we study that in a field study, but in the actual business itself, you might select people based on their socioeconomic status. I've seen research that aims to select people who are members of gangs. I've seen research where we focus on improving the quality of life of people who are imprisoned. Okay, so we actually choose the location based on the sample that we want to study. So one of the strengths of this really, you might not have been expecting this because it sounds like we're winnowing down our selection, but you actually get a broader set of participants than you would for most experiments. So you have higher generalizability. But why? Well, maybe why is what we talked about last week when we focused on the fact that many of our participants are college sophomores in studies like this. And so they're weird, if you remember that acronym. Also, another strength of studies like this is that the participants aren't aware that they're involved in a research study. The study is unobtrusive. So in other words, if you have some experience participating in HPP studies, you've come into a study and you know you're in the study. In the Greenwich Village study that we just talked about, folks did not know that they were in the study, so it was relatively unobtrusive. So this also increases generalizability because it allows us to generalize to a context. We know that this is how people will behave in their natural environment because they're in it. The other thing that's important for constructing field experiments is the independent variable, and I want to talk briefly about that. So one way that you can frame your independent variable is to use naturally occurring stimuli or categories that occur in the field. One example of this might come from the PIF studies that we've talked about before, in which they looked at the type of car people owned, and that was their independent variable representing social class. So, for example, here, some folks are in this class might be picking grocery stores to represent social class. So, for example, maybe the difference between shopping at Sprouts and shopping at say the Winco. One is typically associated with more expensive items in there, and so it might vary along the lines of social class. And it's well known that grocery stores some are more expensive than others. I go into the Sprouts sometimes and I try to buy bread and I look at the price and I'm like, is there gold in this? Do you not know that this is the same bread that I could buy over at the Walmart for $2 and it's $4 here? Are you kidding me? But there's some differences in the social classes that might be going into these stores. I also hate the size of the aisles in the Sprouts. It's way too small, and people are bumping into each other all the time. Okay, how about another example? Let's say that a researcher is interested in bystander helping, maybe like on something like in the Sprinter. So if you ride the Sprinter to and from work, and in the San Marcos or Vista or Escondido areas, and they want to code for who needs help. So maybe older adults need help, or maybe a mother with children, or maybe a lost tourist or panhandler. And they also may code for the number of bystanders in the car. Another way that we can frame independent variables, I just pause the recording real quick. Just pause. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. All right. So another way that you can frame your independent variables is that you can actually introduce systematic variance into the research setting. Or in other words, you can manipulate or create the categories in your independent variable. You don't just allow them to happen, like in the last example, like who are you helping, a mother or a panhandler or an older adult? So you can make it an experiment too. So it can be a correlational study if you don't manipulate your independent variable, or an experiment like in the example that I'm going to give you here, when you do manipulate it. Okay, so let's just say that the researcher is interested in bystander helping, and they might manipulate whether a Confederate on the subway needs help, and they also manipulate the Confederate. So maybe they have an actor in the study who's either low or high status, and maybe they drop some books all over the place, and each trial records a case. So say I come in at one point in time on the Sprinter and I drop my books all over the place and I'm dressed in a suit and tie. Maybe some folks might be more willing to help me because I'm well dressed. Although I think I have to shave this thing off. And then another time I come in I'm wearing more tattered clothes and I drop a stack of papers all over the place. Maybe folks might be less inclined to help me, but what are we doing? We're manipulating the attire that the experimenter's wearing. So here's another example. This one always cracks me up because we actually use it in our class, but it's a shopping cart theory. I'll read you a little bit of this, but this guy posted on Twitter that the shopping cart is the ultimate litmus test for whether a person's capable of self-governing or whether they're a moral person. So to return a shopping cart is easy. It's convenient. And it's a task that we all recognize it's correct and it's appropriate. It's the right thing to do. It's objectively right. There's no situations other than like dire emergencies, like maybe you got a phone call and you have to leave right away, and you just leave the shopping cart and you run. There's no other situations like that that keep us from returning the shopping cart. But at the same time, it's not illegal to abandon your shopping cart. So this is an apex example of whether a person will do the right or wrong thing without being forced to do it. Okay, so let's say that we have half of the folks in a study watch a model. So this is a modeling study. No, not that kind of modeling, not Tyra Banks. Modeling where somebody does a task in front of you and it's so that it helps you to model the behavior. So say we design a study in which half of the folks see a person returning their shopping cart as they're walking out. So you're walking out of the Walmart, doing your thing, like, excuse me, I'm over here shopping. Do you mind? But there's somebody in front of you who walks their shopping cart up and puts it away. But the other half of the participants see a model leave their shopping cart in a parking space. How terrible. Okay, so this would be an experiment. We judge whether or not do they put the cart back or do they leave it out in their own parking space. So maybe having a person model what to do is an independent variable that we can manipulate. But there's also some issues with field experiments, and we're going to talk about this. Selection bias is a big issue, and this is a big threat to our internal validity. So participants, researchers, or simple geography can differentially select who is in the sample and who is in different levels of the independent variable. This was a big issue potentially in the Greenwich Village study because people were not approaching the more seedy looking characters or threatening looking characters. But in studies like this, it's really hard to randomly assign participants to experimental conditions without having selection bias. So just know that maybe people who are participating in your study aren't allowing you to make strong claims about the internal validity of the relation between the independent and dependent variable. Okay. So I have an example from this, from my time in graduate school. There was a CO2 breathing study where I don't even know what happened. I honestly didn't participate in this study, but one of the researchers was having students come in and hook themselves up to CO2 and see how long they could breathe it in before giving up. This is stereotyping, and stereotyping's wrong, but I just imagine like a bunch of like dudes coming into this study and like competing with each other and being like, hey, how long did you get? So maybe there might have been some selection bias in that study. I don't actually know if there was selection bias in that study, but what I'm trying to tell you is that maybe not everybody wants to join a CO2 breathing study. That's not really up my alley. There's people who like to jump out of airplanes with parachutes attached to their back, and you won't catch me doing that ever. That's not something that I want to do. Okay. So another issue that could come up is with self-report. You can actually take questionnaires around from person to person. And it's possible to ask people self-report questions, but please don't do that. Remember, the major advantage to field studies is that we can observe people's real behaviors out there in the field unobtrusively. They're not aware that you're studying them, okay? So we're going to go off to our next lecture here in just a moment, focusing on quasi-experiments.